Hello everyone, and welcome back to Translationborne, the show where we talk all about translation, Bloodborne, and the translation of Bloodborne. This time, we're going to take this elevator down to talk with someone, but before we do that, I just want to provide a warning that some of the dialogues featured later in the episode can get pretty intense. The section of the video from 6:51 to 12:36 involves a portrayal of the suffering of the research hall patients. If you'd rather avoid that unpleasantness, you may want to skip that part and go straight to the Amygdalan Arm discussion. Right now, though, let's talk to someone who's doing well.
Is that you, Lady Maria? No. You're someone else.
Yeah, can I help you?
Please, could you do something for me? I need brain fluid. Murky, mushy brain fluid.
Sure, I'll keep an eye out. But while we're on the hunt for brain fluid, let's do a quick analysis of the character voice in those lines. Granted, this is an exceptionally short bit of dialogue, so it's too early to draw any strong conclusions, but there are two aspects of the Japanese that come through fairly well. First, this is someone who addresses us respectfully, and second, she uses a good deal of feminine speech patterns. Her politeness can be seen when she refers to the player character using the honorific o before the word kata, which is itself an honorific way of addressing someone unknown to the speaker. Despite this, the woman's speech pattern on the whole isn't very formal. For example, she uses the plain form throughout these lines, most notably in the string of verbs at the end of the second sentence, kiite moraenai kashira. Furthermore, the way she opens her final line by saying what she wants, then implicitly repeating her request, as indicated by the section I've added in brackets, makes her come across as speaking casually. Of course, in addition to being informal, the use of the word kashira and later the exclamatory no also emphasize the speaker's femininity. This is further enhanced in a more subtle fashion by the way the woman removes other sentence final particles. The result is a speech style that makes it sound like this is a woman who normally speaks informally, but who's being polite to us even though she doesn't know who we are. In English, while it again seems a little early to be drawing any firm conclusions, I think the resulting dialogue works well at creating the same effect. Rather than have the woman come across as laying it on thick though, which she would if she addressed us as an honorable personage, the translators have instead made her entreaty to us sound both reasonable and polite. The phrasing, "Please, could you do something for me?" works not only to get across the basic meaning of her request, but as a way of showing her willingness to treat us with respect. It may not be a perfect mirror of what's in the Japanese, but I would say that all the most important aspects of this character's speech patterns have been preserved. So, having covered what we can of this woman's character voice, let's turn now to the actual content of her lines. Here, the translation choice that most interests me comes right in the first line, where the Japanese has her adopt a questioning tone, while the English puts in a direct statement. This might seem like a questionable move, but I actually like it because it emphasizes an implication of the Japanese in a way that perfectly fits Bloodborne. In the original, when this woman questioningly raises the possibility of whether we're someone besides Lady Maria, she's doing so because she immediately has reason to believe that we're not Lady Maria. Sure enough, if we look ahead, we can see that she's eventually able to specifically identify our player character. So what's really happening in the first line is a tentative correction of the woman's initial thought. This is exactly what we get from the official English, "No, you're someone else." But that's not all. By phrasing the line this way, a player is more likely to stop and ask themselves just how this woman can possibly realize this when her head is a giant blob and she's physically restrained. In addition to being somewhat mysterious and creepy though, it's also a line that could inspire players to think about how it must take a lot of insight for someone to identify our character like that. This, of course, could not be more on theme for Bloodborne, so I like how the translators have taken this one small moment, based on nothing but a subtle implication in the original, and used it to enhance the game's atmosphere for English-speaking players. Oh, and speaking of atmosphere, how are you doing?
Blip, blop. Blip, blop.
So, good then?
Splish, splash, splish, splash.
Uh-huh, right as rain, I see. While those aren't exactly the most articulate lines of dialogue, though, they do represent some cool nuance in the official approach to onomatopoeia. As we've seen before, most notably with the empty dialogue box that appears when the doll is asleep, the official English approach to onomatopoeia is to get rid of any textual version of whatever sound effect is being made and instead rely on the voice actor to create the appropriate noise. In general, this approach works well. After all, Japanese has far more onomatopoeia than English does, and makes more frequent use of them in ordinary conversation. For instance, the Japanese word for the sound of heavy rain is za, and it wouldn't be out of place to refer to the sudden arrival of a downpour by saying, "Kyū ni ame ga za to futte kita." Literally, this would work out to something like, "Suddenly, the rain came down with a whoosh." And while that English sentence is understandable, it's also an unusual way to describe the onset of heavy rain. In Japanese, though, that phrasing is fairly normal. Similarly, it's not out of the ordinary for Japanese to visually represent sounds like groans, snores, or laughs in writing. And just like a more natural English wording for describing a sudden intense rainfall would involve dropping the whoosh sound, not writing out phonetic versions of the crazed laughter or other sounds the NPCs make in the game is a perfectly understandable way to present their dialogues in English. However, in the case of this research hall patient, we have someone actually speaking the onomatopoeia for various sounds related to water. These aren't naturalistic sounds being written out, the patient is just making these water sounds. As such, recreating them with English language onomatopoeia for similar water sounds makes perfect sense. At the same time, though, because such sounds and their representations have been so thoroughly removed from the rest of the game, I think these have the added effect of making this patient come across as mad. It's another way the official English subtly enhances the intended experience. But the real horror lies ahead, which is why you might want to jump to the Amygdalan Arm discussion if you don't want to hear people suffering.
Just kill me. Free me from this place before I go mad.
Don't worry, I will put you out of your misery, but first I have some other people to talk to. I actually want to look at all the dialogues we get from this room as a whole because they help establish some narrative through lines that will be important to understanding what comes later. So, as we listen to these next few lines, consider how everything we've heard from these patients ties together.
Someone help me. I'm guilty. I know. But I won't do it again. I promise. The dumb darkness. It frightens me. And it rises from its very depths.
I'm sorry, you're clearly having a bad time. Anyone else?
Lady Maria, please take my hand. Please help me. Don't let me drown.
Again, I'm sorry you're not well. But now that we've gotten all the dialogues from the patients in this room, let's go over what we've learned so far. One consistent piece of information we get involves a lack of sight. The very first patient we hear from upon entering the research hall is searching for their eyes, and while to them everything appears pale, we've just heard from someone else about a damp darkness that also blocks vision. And that second line brings us to another important piece of information, the recurring element of water. That patient who lost their eyes, they claim to have dropped them in a puddle. Meanwhile, we have another description of the darkness that specifically identifies it as being damp, and there's a third patient who's afraid of drowning. Finally, let's not forget about the one who speaks only in onomatopoeia associated with the movement of water. This is significant because, as we know from the final lines on the lake and deep sea runes, large volumes of water seem to separate ordinary minds from the extraordinary, and the Healing Church appears to be trying to overcome that hindrance. Some of the patients even seem to realize what the Church is aiming for, or at least that's my interpretation of one of them asking for salvation due to being unable to hear anything. The one undeniable thing that dialogue does, though, is to highlight the importance of sound. This is another crucial aspect of the patient's experience, and it's further emphasized by that NPC who only speaks in onomatopoeia. While being unable to hear anything may be lamentable, though, the results of success might not be pleasant either. After all, whatever the water is blocking appears to be linked to the madness and horror these patients display. This is most evident in the line where one person screams after thinking about what comes from the bottom of the damp darkness. and combined with the rest of what we know about the game, that dialogue ends up giving me a Lovecraftian sense that the human mind may be unable to bear the knowledge that waits on the other side of the water. Still, as distressed as these patients get, there does seem to be a common source of comfort that they can rely on. That would be Lady Maria, a highly respected woman apparently tied to the Healing Church, whose name we've heard several times now. She is the last of the Throughlines we've seen up to this point, though like most of the others, she'll have to remain an enigma for the time being. One thing we can talk about now, though, is how the official translation has managed to convey all of this in English. Now, to be fair, some of that information would come through regardless, like the calling out for Lady Maria and the explicit references to water. But there are other aspects of the Japanese that it would be easy to lose in a literal rendering, and this is where I think the official translation really shines. In particular, the translators have done an amazing job of building an atmosphere of madness, suffering, and dread. For example, look at the second line of the patient who opens by begging for death. In Japanese, this person is saying how being in their present location has become unbearable, then remarking on how they feel like they're on the verge of madness. Rendered literally, it feels almost cliché, but the translators have found a way to give this line the strength it deserves, by bringing forward some less literal implications of the original. First, they make the patient's statement about not being able to stand the research hall a direct request for freedom. And second, they emphasize how the imminent threat of madness is the result of that person's being here. This transforms the patient's words into a personal plea that's more likely to affect a player, emphasizing the horror of the research hall. In other words, by making the lines more natural, the translators are better able to build the proper atmosphere. You can see the same principle at work in the lines of the patient who is afraid of the damp darkness. In Japanese, this NPC says twice that they're afraid, then identifies the subject of their fear as being the damp darkness. In English, though, the translators instead have the NPC trail off after mentioning the damp darkness, then stutter out how afraid they are. This more natural presentation means the same information is given an emotional heft it might otherwise lack in English. There's a reason that it's the room with these horrified patients that I felt it necessary to provide a warning about, because I think the translators do such a good job of delivering on the intended atmosphere of horror. I know when I play the game, that's the room I specifically remember for being so disturbing. And as we'll see, this place is almost certainly intended to produce that kind of effect on players. As much as I admire how effective those translations are, though, I'd prefer to end on a lighter note. Arm of small amen. The higher rank ones called amendoado. A single arm of an individual one that out of them was small. Strictly speaking, this is no device-installed weapon or anything at all, but among abnormal ones, there are those who swing this as a weapon. Normally a mass of bone, like a large, hard, blunt instrument, but when this is extended and swung, its tip is said to writhe as if it were still alive. I have to admit, for all the creepiness of that last line, I've always found the idea of this weapon pretty funny, since it's literally just a missing limb you can swing around. But that's not to say the translation work on the description isn't impressive. In particular, I like how the official English takes all the relevant information from the first couple lines of the Japanese and reworks it into something that better fits the target language. I've mentioned before how in Japanese writing it's perfectly acceptable to have a sentence modify a noun and then let that stand as a complete thought. This sounds incredibly awkward in English, because once you fully modify the noun, that word feels like it should be the subject of another sentence that doesn't exist in Japanese. Well, in the original, this description opens with two such phrases. The first identifies amygdalas as great ones, while the second highlights the single arm of a comparatively small amygdala. By unwritten implication, that arm is meant to be understood as the weapon that's being described. So, the key information imparted by these two lines is first that this item is one of an amygdala's many arms, second that the amygdala it came from was relatively small, and third that amygdalas are great ones. All of this ends up being conveyed in much briefer form by the official English, which feels to me like a triumph. Sadly, not every aspect of this weapon's translation works out so well. If we turn our attention from the description to the item name, we'll see there's an aspect of how the Japanese has been abbreviated that can't be replicated in the official English. In the original, the name of this weapon has been shortened in two ways. First, rather than write out the word chisai, which means small, only the initial kanji is used. More importantly though, the full-length amendozu has been cut down to amen. This seems to me like a deliberate reference, possibly to the Egyptian god Amun-Ra, which is spelled the same way in Japanese, or possibly to the biblical Hebrew term amen. Of course, there's a chance this is just coincidence, but I'm inclined to doubt that because I don't think the Japanese name has to be as short as it is. Simply by shortening the word chisai down to its initial kanji, the item name with the word amendozu fully spelled out should be a workable length. It would be 9 characters long, which is the same as the Japanese names for Ligarius's Wheel and Ludwig's Holy Blade. So again, I suspect whoever wrote the original wanted to make a deliberate reference to a religious term. Unfortunately though, this is something that couldn't survive the translation process. The great ones known as amendozu in Japanese had already been dubbed Amygdala in the base game, and no abbreviation of that could produce a reference to either Amun-Ra or Amen. Perhaps these great ones could have been renamed with this in mind if the weapon had been included in the original release, but that might make the allusions to the brain region and almond shapes less obvious. As my waving goodbye reminds us though, deadlines are deadlines, and given that Amygdala was already locked in as a translation, I think Amygdalan Arm works perfectly well as a name for this weapon. But if you feel differently, or have any other comments you'd like to make, know that I would love to hear from you. Also, remember that you can expect the Translationborne Index linked below to be updated within 24 hours, providing you with a searchable reference to everything I've talked about in this series. Until next time then, thanks for watching everyone.